My name is Jessica Parker, and I built a company that didn't think I was worth keeping. I'd been at Velocity for 7 years. Not the flashy startup years, the real ones. The ones where you're alone at 3 a.m. fixing architecture nobody else understands. Rebuilding databases that everyone said were impossible. I wasn't the founder. I wasn't on the cap table initially. But they brought me in early as lead engineer, made promises about equity, said I'd be taken care of. I believed them. I was that person in every tech company, the one who actually knew how everything worked. The servers, the infrastructure, the entire backbone that customers depended on. Nobody noticed because everything just worked. That's what good engineering looks like. It's invisible until it isn't. My team consisted of 3 junior engineers, smart kids, but they couldn't do what I did. They couldn't architect at scale, couldn't troubleshoot production disasters, couldn't think through the problems before they became problems. I made them better. And they got raises. They got promotions. They got noticed. Meanwhile, I had meetings. Lots of meetings. Meetings where people asked me to solve problems I'd already solved 3 years earlier. Meetings where I explained the same infrastructure decisions over and over. Meetings where executives nodded like they understood. They didn't. I didn't care. I had stock options. Not many, but enough. The IPO was coming. Everyone knew it. The board meetings got serious. The VCs started showing up more. Suddenly the company cared about quarterly metrics in ways they never had before. Have you ever noticed how a company changes right before the exit? How do they become obsessed with the numbers that matter to investors? How does the actual work that built everything become invisible? That's what happened. The executives started looking at headcount, at burn rate. How many people were in each department? Engineering was too big, they said. Too expensive, they said. We needed to be lean, they said. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, March the 14th. One day before my options officially vested. One day. They had HR, legal, and my director all in the same room. That's how I knew it wasn't a regular conversation. My director couldn't even look at me. That told me everything. The HR manager had the severance papers already printed. We're eliminating your role effective immediately, she said. Not my position, my role. Like I was somehow redundant. Like the 7 years of 80-hour weeks meant nothing. I didn't yell. I didn't cry in the meeting. I just asked one question. What about my vesting? The legal guy shifted in his chair. Your options vest tomorrow, he said. This doesn't change that. He was right technically, but they'd done the math. They'd calculated exactly when to cut me. They had to let me go before options fully vested, but they timed it for the day before. So I'd be unemployed when the shares actually converted. No health insurance to exercise them. No salary to pay the taxes. No stability to hold them through the IPO. They were hoping I'd panic, sell early, take less than they were worth. That's how you engineer a golden handcuffs situation in reverse. I walked out at 2:47 p.m. The security badge didn't work by 3 p.m. That's how it works in tech. Instant erasure. I sat in my car for an hour, not processing, just existing. Then my phone started blowing up. Slack messages from my team. What happened? Where are you? The production database is having issues. We can't figure out how to fix it. I laughed hard. The irony was so clean it hurt. I'd spent 7 years documenting everything. But documentation is useless when the architect is the only person who truly understands the system. When you're the person who lived through every problem, who remembers what you tried 3 years ago, why didn't it work then, why it might work now. You can't document that, can't transfer it, can't duplicate it. By Wednesday, there were 47 unread messages in my personal email from my director, from the VP of engineering, from executives I'd never spoken to before. We made a mistake. Can we talk? We'd like to reconsider. There's no bridge burned here. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because I was clear. I understood what I'd built. And I understood that they had no idea what they had. Here's what they didn't know I knew. I'd been expecting something like this. Not exactly this, but something. So I'd been careful. I'd documented everything in a way that was legally unassailable. I'd kept copies of design specifications, code comments explaining architectural decisions, Meeting notes from problem-solving sessions that had shaped the entire infrastructure. Nothing confidential. Nothing they owned more than I did. Just evidence of intellectual work, evidence of time, evidence of contribution. But more importantly, I'd been tracking the company's financial trajectory, the revenue growth, the customer acquisition numbers, the IPO timeline. I knew what those shares were going to be worth. I did the math. $500,000, maybe more, and they'd fired me one day early. The lawyers would call it bad timing. I called it what it looked like. Intentional, not actionable in court, probably, but definitely the kind of thing that would make investors nervous. The kind of thing that, if they knew, would change how they valued the company. So I reached out to one person, Raymond. He wasn't on staff anymore. He'd been our chief technology officer until a disagreement with the CEO pushed him out 3 years ago. But he'd stayed in the background. Stayed interested. He was also a board observer on our audit committee. I told him what happened. I showed him the dates. I showed him the vesting schedule. I showed him the communications where they'd specifically discuss timing. I didn't ask him to do anything. I just made sure he understood. The IPO roadshow started 3 weeks later, and everything started to fall apart. Not immediately, but visibly. The company's infrastructure began showing strain, production outages, database latency issues, things that never happened when I was there. The board was asking questions. The CFO was losing sleep. The CEO was giving interviews about operational excellence, while the engineering team was drowning. They'd hired replacements, 2 new senior engineers, smart people, but they were running in circles. They were trying to debug systems designed before they even knew what language the database ran on. Then Raymond called a board meeting. He raised a question about the company's technical risks, specifically, the timing of a key personnel departure, the day before options vesting. He wasn't accusatory, just observational. It's interesting, he said, that we eliminated our architect exactly when we're preparing for investor due diligence. The board didn't like that question, but investors would like it worse, and everyone in that room knew it. 2 weeks later, the lead investor called an emergency meeting, not with the full team, with the CEO and the board. They had questions about the vesting timeline, about whether there were any material changes to personnel before the IPO, about whether the board had properly disclosed risks related to key person dependencies. The answers got complicated. They had to admit they'd fired their lead engineer. They had to admit it was 1 day early. They had to admit the technical problems started immediately after. They had to admit they had no contingency plan. The investors started asking whether they should even proceed with the IPO, whether the company's fundamental architecture was at risk, whether there were other problems they didn't know about. The board brought in consultants to audit the infrastructure. The consultants found exactly what I knew they'd find: a system built by one person, a system that was stable because that person had thought through every edge case, a system that was now fragmenting because nobody else understood the original architecture philosophy. The consultants said it would take months to stabilize. They'd need to hire more senior people. They'd need to rebuild entire systems. The IPO got pushed, then pushed again. The company burned through cash-paying contractors to fix problems I'd solved years ago. They tried to reach out to me 3 times. I didn't answer, not out of anger, just clarity. The IPO happened 6 months later, at a lower valuation, with conditions about technical risk that had never been there before. My shares vested anyway, because I was still technically employed when the options converted, and I held them. I watched the IPO. I watched the stock drop 14% in the first week. I watched the financial press start asking questions about whether Velocity had overextended itself technically. I watched the CEO get replaced 18 months later. I watched my former director move to another company. I watched my team, the 3 engineers I'd trained, leave for better opportunities. They'd learned from me. They'd learned what real architecture looked like. They didn't need Velocity anymore. I sold my shares a year after the IPO. Made enough to never work again if I didn't want to. But I did want to. I just wanted to work somewhere that understood what I was worth. Here's what I learned: some companies don't fire you because you're bad. They fire you for one of 3 reasons. You know too much. You cost too much. or they fundamentally don't understand what you do. In my case, it was all three. I was the only person who could maintain the system. That made me expensive. That made me powerful. And power makes people uncomfortable, especially when they've convinced themselves they don't need you. The executives at Velocity didn't wake up wanting to destroy the company. They just made a decision based on incomplete information. They didn't understand that infrastructure isn't a cost center. It's a foundation. And you don't tear down your foundation to save money. Not if you want the building to stand. Have you ever been the person nobody noticed until everything fell apart? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you just stopped? That's the dark magic of being truly good at something. The moment you stop, people realize what you were carrying. But you can't stay just to prove that. You have to leave. You have to let them figure it out. And they will figure it out eventually, just not the way they hoped. If you've ever built something from nothing and watched someone else take credit for it, share that in the comments. Not for validation, but because the person reading might need to know they're not alone. And sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's just being right. The truth didn't destroy them. They built their own disaster. I just walked away.